Welcome back, everybody. We're going to continue our discussion of evolution. So far, the models of evolution that we've looked at weren't quite right. They got some things right, but they didn't withstand vigorous testing. Now, what we're going to look at today is Darwin's model of evolution. We call it a theory of evolution, and I just want to point out that the word theory in science means something quite different than it does in everyday speech. A theory in science is a model. It's predictive. It's based on lots of testing, and it has withstood experimentation and observation. Darwin's theory of evolution has withstood about 175 years of close scrutiny and testing. We still follow it today, but with a few tweaks and modifications. Again, this is not a history course, but I thought it would be interesting to go through Darwin's life and just see how he came up with this theory very briefly. So he was born in 1809 in England, and he decided that he was going to go to medical school. In 1825, he was going to go to the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. A few years later, in 1827, he dropped out of school because, well, he couldn't stand the sight of blood. And it wasn't really his main interest, he figured out. I mean, that's a thing that happens with all students. You'll figure out exactly what your interests are. His father had this to say about him: "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs and rat catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and your family." So, he changed tracks. And now he went to Cambridge to study theology, to study religion. Guess what happened? He dropped out of that too. In 1831, he had this incredible opportunity presented to him. So there was a ship called the HMS Beagle, and it was setting sail around the world. It was going to a lot of places that most Europeans had never seen. And as was the case back in the day, because this ship was going to new lands, not actually new, of course, but new if you're European, they would have a biologist on board to take samples and make notes. They actually had a biologist all set up and arranged, but Darwin got really close and friendly with the captain of this ship and managed to replace the biologist. He had this incredible opportunity to see lots of stuff that most people would not see. And from this, he had several eureka moments where he put together this theory of evolution that we're going to talk about. In 1844, he wrote about his travels and he started to collect data, collect evidence for his theory. In 1859, he published a landmark book known as The Origin of Species. Now, we'll talk about Darwin's voyages in a bit more detail in just a moment, but I want to point out some of the things that Darwin was struck by as he was growing up, as he was a young adult, when he looked at the natural world. What we see here is an orchid, very pretty flower, but if you look carefully, there is also an insect. That's a mantis. It's an orchid mantis. It looks a lot like the flower. It can sit there and lay in wait, perfectly disguised, and when a bee or a butterfly or another pollinator comes along, the mantis will grab onto it and eat it. And he was struck by the magnificence of these relationships. How did this develop? Is it just something that God created from scratch? And I should point out that Darwin was quite deeply religious. Or was there something that changed these two organisms? The flower changed to attract pollinators, and at the same time, the mantis changed to match the flower to catch its prey. Darwin was used to raising animals, as a child and teenager and into his young adult years. He lived on an estate. Darwin did come from a fairly wealthy family, so he had some spare time to look at this stuff intently. But he realized that there are pigeons that we still have today. We still have them in our cities today on statues, on ledges, on buildings that look very, very similar to wild pigeons. They really haven't changed that much. But then at the same time, there are some very specialized domesticated pigeons that look really strange and look quite different from their wild counterparts. On the right, you can see some breeds of pigeon that were already well established in Darwin's time. Some of them have unusual colors. Some of them have very, very large plumage, very, big tail feathers, that kind of thing. You can see one in the top right of that diagram whose neck is bent backwards. They spend their whole life looking up at the sky. They can't even see where they're going. There are pigeons with feathers on their feet. There are all these weird, weird varieties that appeal to the people that bred them. Darwin himself had tinkered in pigeon breeding, and he knew quite well how the process worked. So let's say that you wanted a pigeon with feathers on its feet. Now that's not the norm for the wild rock pigeon, but if that's your thing, you can certainly do that, given enough time. What you might do is raise a whole bunch of pigeons, and the pigeons are going to have variability. All of the offspring are going to look a bit different. I mean, we don't all look the same. Humans don't all look the same. Same with pigeons, they're all going to look a little bit different. And what you do is you pick out pigeons that have maybe little feathers on their feet. And you just allow them to breed. So you set them aside and you breed them. And if that is a genetic trait, if it's a heritable trait, then it will be passed down to their offspring. So you breed them, you hatch the eggs, and then hopefully you're going to get quite a few chicks that have feathers on their feet. There's going to be variability there as well. Some of them will have bigger feathers. You take those and you only allow those to breed. And now the next generation, you get bigger feathers. You look for birds in that group that have more feathers and bigger feathers on their feet, and you breed them. So we do this generation after generation. We keep selecting for the most obvious examples of the trait we're interested in. We keep breeding them, and then over time that is going to amplify the trait and give us something that's new and unusual. Darwin also loved dogs, and he was well aware of how many different breeds of dogs there are and how distinctive they are. And again, the fact that you can breed a new breed of dog within a human lifespan by just picking for certain traits, looking for individuals that are really odd but appeal to you and have the same traits, breeding them together, you can emphasize that trait. So that's the reason we have border collies and German shepherds and pugs and retrievers, etc. And we can actually interbreed these dogs. No matter how different they are, they're actually still the same species. Something we'll talk about a lot more when we talk about speciation. But again, the main point was that you can change animals. You can change animals by artificial selection. That's where humans select which individuals get to mate and produce offspring. Now look at these two individuals. We've got a wolf and we've got a Chihuahua. They're very different, but the Chihuahua came from the wolf. All the breeds of dogs that we have today came from selective, or also known as artificial, breeding of native wolf species. These two individuals could still intermate. Now, physically, there'd be some issues. You'd have to give the Chihuahua a step stool, I guess, or something. I don't know, don't want to think about it. But these are the same species. They have just been modified, in the case of the Chihuahua, by what humans were interested in. And the Chihuahua was modified over a relatively short period of time. I'm a big fan of rabbits. I currently have 2 rabbits. I did have a rabbit for 13 years that was litter trained and ran around the house like a cat and came when it was called. But anyway, that's kind of off topic. But look at our native rabbit here. This is a native English cottontail rabbit. And Darwin was also, of course, aware that we have many, many breeds of domestic rabbit. And again, it just comes down to artificially selecting the traits you're interested in. We have lop-eared rabbits. So within any population of rabbits, you might have a few individuals that have floppy ears. If you like that trait, then wait till you get another one and interbreed them. So work this out with your neighbors, find 2 floppy-eared rabbits, bring them together and mate them, and there's a possibility that their offspring will have that trait if it's a genetic trait. And now, when you take those rabbits and interbreed them again, you're always going to get that floppy-eared trait. And this floppy-eared trait can get kind of ridiculous. So this is an English lop rabbit. The one at the top there is a Holland lop. And the English lop rabbit has these ridiculously long ears. Now, of course, if it was living in the wild, it would be tripping over those. Those would not be helpful. It has those ears because humans thought they were interesting or funny or cute or whatever, and they bred rabbits with long ears and got longer and longer ears each generation. And we have some truly strange rabbit breeds now. The one at the top there is an Angora, so really, really fluffy. We've selectively bred individuals that have extra fluffy fur, and that gave us this thing, which we can use to make Angora sweaters. And then we have a lion's mane rabbit there. And then we have this ridiculous Angora rabbit. As you can imagine, probably wouldn't survive in the wild, but humans didn't care about that. They were artificially selecting for individuals with lots of fur that could be used to make wool. Artificial selection has been taken to extremes with plants. All the plants you see here have one big thing in common. They're all the same species. So we have things like cabbage and cauliflower, and broccoli and kale, and all the stuff that makes up a lot of our food. It's all derived from wild mustard. So wild mustard is a native natural plant, and it was native to parts of Europe. And Europeans started breeding this, specifically looking for weird mutants. You can see that there's a big distance between the nodes. The nodes are where the leaves or flowers branch off. So we have a lot of stem between those nodes in the wild mustard. But occasionally we'd have plants that were very short and all those nodes were packed together. In addition to that, some of those plants might have had larger leaves. People focused on those plants. They took those plants, they collected the seeds, they raised them up, they bred them with other plants that had the same traits, and over time they emphasized those traits and we got cabbage. Broccoli is really interesting. When you're eating broccoli, what you're eating is a big cluster of flowers that haven't opened yet. So broccoli is a mutant of wild mustard that has lots and lots of little flower buds. It produces way more flowers than we would see in wild mustard. And again, people looked at plants that had lots of extra buds, bred them with themselves to create broccoli. Cauliflower is even weirder. It's basically broccoli, but there's no chlorophyll in those flower buds. They're little tiny flower buds that are totally anemic. They have none of the chlorophyll whatsoever. So again, The point here is that you can modify plants and animals and other organisms very quickly, not by going in and tinkering with the genes necessarily, but by picking out mutants that have unusual genes, unusual versions of genes, and only breeding those individuals to get these really, really bizarre plants. Almost all of the domesticated plants that we eat and the domesticated animals that we eat are very, very different from their ancestors. Humans have changed them over a relatively short period of time by just interbreeding really odd mutants. So at the top there, we have a wild boar, and it still looks a lot like a pig, but we know that modern day pigs look quite a bit different. Farmers were interested in pigs that weren't hairy. They were interested in pigs that were much bigger, etc. And that's the pigs that they allowed to interbreed. The chicken is interesting because it's one that's not that different from the wild animal it came from. There's a chicken that lives wild on the forest floors of the Amazon, and that's where our chickens came from, but still they are quite a bit different. If we look at corn, it's very different. So look at corn down there in the lower left. You can see the native corn on the far left. This was a grass-like plant that had just a few kernels on it. And over time, and this is something that happened thousands of years ago, humans started agriculture about 10,000 years ago. Humans looked for plants that had more kernels because that was more food. And they kept breeding those plants and they kept culling or killing off, not allowing the native plants to breed. They only allowed these mutants to breed, and over time we got corn. Again, a lot different from the native ancestor. The same thing with cattle down the bottom there. You can see what's thought to be the ancestor of cattle. It was actually hunted to extinction by humans. It's gone. But all of these animals are very, very different from what they once were. Again, it just goes back to the power of selection. If you ever do decide to read Darwin's book on the origin of species, first of all, congratulations, kudos for trying to read it. It is a bit of a slog. Darwin is a very poetic writer and he's kind of long-winded, but it is quite interesting. If you do read that book, you'll find that Darwin has devoted an entire chapter to the domestication of animals by humans. He stresses how selection, so selection for who gets to breed and who doesn't, can change the makeup of a population very quickly. Over a few generations, we can see big changes. Now, Darwin was very struck by domestication. He was also very much influenced by this guy. This is Thomas Malthus, and he was not a biologist. He was an economist. He studied human populations, and he realized that sometimes human populations can grow very, very quickly. So they can grow geometrically. They can double from generation to generation. But the food supply doesn't grow at the same rate. So as we get a greater population, we might get a bit better at getting food from our fields, but it might not keep up with the population growth. Now, he was studying poor societies. He was studying, for instance, the Irish, which at the time were quite badly struggling. You might have heard of the potato famines and so on. And he found that populations would grow quickly in these poorer individuals. They would have lots of children, but it came to a point where there was not enough food to support everyone, and a struggle for existence resulted from that. Darwin saw this same struggle for existence in natural populations. So putting that stuff together, putting artificial selection, what we've learned from that, and what we've learned from Malthus and others, he suggested that in nature, generally more individuals are born than resources can support. So we have lots of parents, parent snakes, parent flowers, etc., that are producing as many offspring as they can, but there's simply not enough resources out there in the world to support all of them. So they can't all survive. And what he suggested was the individuals that were best suited to the environment, so the predators that were best able to catch prey, the herbivores that were best able to escape predators, etc., the individuals that had a higher fitness, we'll talk about that more in a minute. That just means that they're better able to collect resources and find mates and survive. Those individuals were selected for. Not by humans, of course, but selected for by nature, I guess you could say. And his famous quote here is, "Man selects for his own good, nature only for that of the being which she tends." If you're better at surviving, you're more likely to survive. And if you're more likely to survive, you're more likely to leave behind offspring. And those offspring will inherit the traits that made you better able to survive. Now let's take a look at some of Darwin's evidence. The Origin of Species is a long book, and it's mostly just Darwin presenting evidence for his views. And a lot of that evidence came from his voyages around the world, particularly his voyage on the HMS Beagle. Darwin set sail on a 5-year voyage, much of it in the southern hemisphere. He got to see lots of things that Europeans at the time were totally ignorant of. There were some reportings of weird animals, for instance, in Australia, like the platypus, and some stuffed specimens had been sent back to Europe, but everyone in Europe thought they were fake. They thought they'd taken a bill off of a duck and stuck it onto maybe a beaver or a muskrat. Darwin got to see a lot of cool things firsthand. So he went to South America, he went to Africa, he went to Australia, and perhaps most famously, he got to see the Galapagos Islands. This is a set of islands about 1,000 kilometers off the western shore of South America. What did Darwin see in the Galapagos? He saw a chain of islands, lots of islands, and the islands differed quite a bit in size, they differed in environment, they differed in the communities of plants and animals that lived there. These islands are created by volcanic activity. What happens is magma comes up through the floor of the ocean and it solidifies and it creates new islands. Some of the newest islands are less than 1 million years old. Some of the older islands are close to 5 million years old. As the islands age, the rock erodes, soil is created, and we get more plant life. We get more diversity of plant life, and we get, of course, lots of animal species that are dependent on that plant life and other things that are feeding on that plant life. So some islands are kind of sterile almost. The ones that have been formed recently, geologically speaking, consist of mainly jagged rock. There's not a whole lot living there, except perhaps along the coast. And other islands have thick vegetation growing on them. He noticed that on some islands there were sea lions, and the sea lions were fairly similar to the ones he had seen in South America. Remember, he visited mainland South America as well. He also saw things like marine iguanas, And these iguanas were bigger than what he had seen in South America, and they had some different behaviors. So they would feed on seaweed and algae along the coast. They'd also swim out and dive quite deeply to get other stuff off of the ocean floor. He also noticed tortoises. Now, tortoises on the Galapagos had been used as a resource for quite a long time by sailors. You can grab a couple of tortoises if you're going on a long ocean voyage, and you can put them in the hold of your ship, and they will survive, not very happily, I'm sure, and then you can eat them when you need to. But Darwin looked at the tortoises that were found on the different islands, and he found that they differed from island to island. In fact, it got to the point where someone could just show him a shell of a tortoise and he could tell them which island it came from. You can see this tortoise here has this kind of brim on the shell, and tortoises that lived on very jagged islands where they had to have lots of movement, they had to lift themselves over rocks, tended to have a brim to their shell that was further back. Tortoises that lived on more eroded islands that were flatter and easier to get around on, like what you're seeing here, had a brim that came out much further because it didn't limit the movement of the legs. So he saw distinct differences, very obvious, measurable differences between tortoises that lived on each of the different islands. And he hypothesized that these tortoises came from the mainland originally. They washed out somehow to the islands, and the island they found themselves on determined how they changed and evolved after that. They became better suited to the type of terrain they would have to deal with. Very famously, Darwin also studied the finches of the Galapagos. And actually, this group of finches is named after him now. It's known as Darwin's finches. He went from island to island, and remember, each island had a slightly different environment, and he noticed that the finches were a little bit different from island to island. In particular, he noticed that the beaks, the bills, were different. On some islands, there was lots of heavy seeds and nuts, and the finches there had very heavy bills that could crack open those seeds and nuts. On other islands, there was a lot of insects, and he saw finches that had very slender bills that could be used to catch insects or perhaps slip under the bark of trees and collect grubs and larvae. He noticed that overall, though, the bodies of these finches, some of the other structures of these finches, resembled finches he had seen in mainland South America. And he hypothesized that some of the mainland finches had been blown off course. We get major storms in this area all the time, and some of them may have found their way to the Galapagos Islands. Now, this would be a very rare event, but over thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, this certainly would happen occasionally. The birds that found themselves in the Galapagos, as they moved from island to island, they changed to match the local environment. This is selection. It's not artificial selection where humans select stuff. It's natural selection. Nature basically is selecting who is more likely to survive and reproduce. So if it was an island where the main food source was seeds and nuts, in a population of finches, there's going to be lots of variation, just as there is in humans. I mean, look at all the humans around you. They're all a bit different. In a population of birds, there's going to be differences with respect to their bill size. The birds that had slightly larger bills had a very slight advantage. They were more likely to live long enough to mate and have offspring. The offspring would inherit that trait. So over time, we would see an increase in the number of birds with large bills. On the left, you can see his actual diagram that he wrote in his notes while he was visiting the Galapagos. And what he proposed, again, was that birds from South America ended up there, and as they branched out and moved from island to island, they gave rise to new populations, which eventually became new species. His drawing there is what we would now call today a phylogenetic tree, and we'll get back to that. As you might imagine, the Galapagos Islands have a special place in the heart of biologists, and many modern-day biologists have gone back and studied the finches in more detail. What you're seeing here is a phylogenetic tree. For the moment, we can think of this as like a family tree that was made using DNA sequences. Biologists have isolated DNA from these finches and then compared the sequences to work out their relationships. So at the bottom, we have the common ancestor of the Galapagos finches. This is the bird or birds that were wafted over by tropical storms onto the Galapagos. And as they moved from island to island, they diversified, they changed, and they became new species. So here we see Darwin's idea. We have a species of finch from the South American mainland. We'll call it species A, and it migrates or is blown off course and finds itself on one of the Galapagos Islands. So at this point, we have a population of birds there. They're interbreeding. They're presumably happy, maybe not, but we have this new population of species A in the Galapagos. Hundreds, thousands of years go by, and these birds change. They change because the environment on this island in the Galapagos is different from their original home on the mainland. There's different food available. There's going to be a selective force occurring. Natural selection is going to select the animals that are best adapted, the birds that are best adapted to that environment, and the food sources that are there are more likely to survive and more likely to leave behind offspring. So over time, species A morphs into species B. And I'll talk a lot more about what I mean by that. But basically, this species becomes so different that even if we took it and reintroduced it to the mainland birds, they might not interbreed. They might be just so different. Sometimes there can be changes in the chromosomal arrangements, changes in the way genes are aligned on the chromosomes that they can't actually interbreed, or it could be that they've developed different songs and different colors and different dances and different mating rituals. So even if they could interbreed, they won't. But anyway, at this point, the second part of that diagram on the right, we have this species A changing into a new species, species B. Now, species B might migrate to another island of the Galapagos chain. And again, these islands are all different. They all have different environments. There are going to be different traits that are selected for on each of the islands. And species B changes over time, and now we will refer to it as species C. Species C can move on to different islands, including the original island. And because now it's quite different from the original population of birds, it won't interbreed with them, and it can remain a distinct species. And this continues on, and you can see species develop into new species. They migrate around. They come into contact with each other again, but if they've changed sufficiently, they won't interbreed. And over time, we get an increased diversity of species, and this is known as adaptive radiation. Alrighty, so what Darwin has shown us so far is that artificial selection allows us to make very rapid changes in populations of domesticated animals and plants. So we as humans decide exactly which pairs of animals or pairs of plants will have a chance to mate. He's also started talking about natural selection, and this is where nature is the selector, not humans. So in natural selection, there are going to be some organisms that are better able to get food, better able to compete, better able to find mates, and better able to avoid predation and other dangers. Those individuals are more likely to survive to adulthood and leave behind offspring, and they're going to pass on the traits that made them successful. This is a much slower process. But there is another process. In addition to natural selection, there is another form of selection, and this is known as sexual selection. So not only does nature select for who's more likely to survive and mate, but of course, mates select their mates. What you're seeing here are a pair of cardinals. We've got a female cardinal on the left and a male on the right, and you can see they're quite different. And the reason they're different is not because of natural selection, it's because of sexual selection. The female is kind of drab, kind of boring, I guess, when it comes to colors, but that makes sense because she's going to sit on a nest and she's going to incubate eggs. Natural selection is a driving force that will make the female, in this example, camouflaged. She's going to be more difficult to notice by a predator if she blends in with their surroundings. But the female birds look for males that are very brightly colored. So the male cardinal here is quite pretty. He's got this really nice red color to him. That's not really to his advantage when it comes to natural selection. It makes him stand out. In fact, it makes him more vulnerable to predation. So the fact that this male can be bright red and stand out like that and still survive is attractive to the female. It means that this male has good genes. It's got good genetics. It can survive, and hopefully it's going to pass those traits that make it successful on to its offspring that it's going to have with this female. And when we're dealing with sexual selection, it is usually the female that drives it. The females are selecting for certain traits. Here is a more extreme example. This is a male magnificent frigate bird, quite magnificent, and it literally puffs out its chest. It has this massive sac on its chest that's bright, bright red. And as you can imagine, this isn't going to help it fly. It isn't going to help it avoid predators. It isn't going to help it get food, but it is going to help it get mates. Remember that when we're talking about natural selection or sexual selection, if you don't pass your traits on to the next generation, if you don't have offspring, those traits might disappear. If there's no one else in the population that has those traits, they could be completely eliminated. So it comes down to two things. When we're talking about Darwinian fitness, this refers to how likely an organism is to pass on its genes to the next generation. There's two parts to that. It has to survive, it has to avoid predators, it has to feed itself. All of that is under the control of natural selection, but also it has to find mates, and it has to mate and produce offspring. And quite often, that is going to be influenced strongly by sexual selection. If you're a male magnificent frigate bird and you don't have this great big red pouch, females will have nothing to do with you. You won't mate and you won't pass on those genes, and those forms of genes called alleles, we'll talk about that later, are going to disappear. And just to emphasize once again, having this ridiculous red balloon attached to your chest, making you a target for any possible predator and slowing you down is not helpful in terms of natural selection. It's only helpful in attracting a mate. Here we have a field of nesting frigate birds. The one in the front there is a female. So you can see she's white and brown and she blends in reasonably well with her surroundings. She's sitting on a nest that she has made, and now she's looking for a male to fertilize her eggs so that she can lay eggs and then incubate them. There's a whole lot of suitors out there. We have lots of males out in the background. They're puffing up their chests. They also do a little dance and a little song, and she's going to pick the one that she prefers. Again, this is sexual selection. And ironically, it does, again, put the male at risk. So she's looking for a male that has this exquisite coloration, this over-the-top plumage, and this big puffy chest, because that male was able to survive even with this impediment. Here's another dramatic example. So on the left, we have a female. She's not nearly as flashy, again, because she needs to sit on a nest and she needs to be camouflaged from any predators. And in front of her, we have a very magnificent looking male wood duck. He really stands out. Now, it's also thought that the colors and just the vibrancy of the colors indicate health. Male wood ducks that are especially pretty are also especially healthy, and this is an indication of good genes, good genetics, and that's what the female is looking for. She will actively avoid any male that doesn't have really pretty feathers or any male that doesn't know the right dance or doesn't know the right song. A couple more examples that you might be familiar with. On the left, we have a pair of mallard ducks. The female is in front and the male is behind. And to the left, we have bluebirds. The male bluebird is on the front of the nesting box there, and the female is on top. When we have males and females that look or behave very differently, we refer to that as a case of sexual dimorphism. Di means two, morph means form. And this doesn't happen in all species of animals, but in many animals you can tell the males and females apart very readily. That's the sexual dimorphism, and it's driven by sexual selection. And again, it's almost always the female selecting for an appropriate male. Here is perhaps the best known example of sexual dimorphism. There's a bird known as a peafowl. The female is known as a peahen, and the male is known as a peacock, and that's what you're seeing here. The peacock has this incredible plumage. So it has these very long tail feathers with very, very bright iridescent eye spots. Those big circles might look like eyes to a predator, and when this thing is fully extended, it might actually scare off a predator, but that's not the main role. The main role of these feathers is to attract a peahen, to attract a female. And the peacock will do a little dance, it'll make a little call, and it'll shake these feathers around. Now, other than mating, the feathers don't help the peacock all that much. They slow it down a lot. Can't fly, of course, but it also can't move all that quickly. It's going to get these feathers tangled up in branches and so on. And also, it takes a lot of resources, a lot of food, a lot of nourishment to grow these feathers. There has been a lot of research done on peacocks, and it has been shown that peacocks that have really bright iridescent feathers are healthier. So the main point here is to show off to potential mates that I am really healthy. I have good genes. I want to share my genes with you and make some kids. our kids are going to have those good genes as well. And any males that result from this mating, well, they're going to have this trait also. And that trait is going to become emphasized in males from generation to generation. Sexual selection can get out of hand. Sometimes it leads to traits that really are quite deleterious. They're quite destructive to the males that have to support these weird structures or these weird behaviors. Here what you're seeing is a really nice example of that. This is the Irish elk. The Irish elk is an extinct deer, and you can see it was very large. You can see a human there for scale. They had these massive antlers, only the males had these, and they grew these to attract mates. So these were around in the time of the last ice age. They went extinct at the end of the ice age. Why did they go extinct? Well, there's probably some environmental reasons. Of course, the environment was changing, but it's also thought that the males just had a hard time dealing with these massive antlers. The antlers were there to attract mates. So if you were a male with a small rack, you probably weren't going to get a female. And also the antlers were used to chase away and to joust with competing males. But imagine trying to grow this set of antlers, and these were shed every year. These things are made of calcium carbonate and other salts that you could use for building bones and for doing lots of other stuff in your body. So you're sacrificing all of that potential nourishment. Also, these things are heavy, and these things would make it very difficult to tromp through the woods, right? You're going to get these tangled up. This makes life very difficult. So the Irish elk, why did it go extinct? Probably due to changing environment, so natural selection, but probably also due to out of control sexual selection, where the males were put at a huge disadvantage. We talked about giraffes when we talked about Lamarck. Let's go back and talk about them again now that we've looked at Darwin's theory. First of all, there is no driving force for things to get better. Natural selection causes species to change in a way that makes them better adapted to their environment. They might get more complicated, they might get simpler, as is the case for parasites, as we'll see later on. So if you were a giraffe and you have a slightly longer neck than, let's say, all the other giraffes around you, you do have a slight advantage because you can reach food that other giraffes cannot. But it's not that you stretch your neck over the course of your life. Instead, if we take a look at any litter of giraffes and we measure their neck lengths, there's variability. In all of the offspring of the parental giraffes, there's going to be variability. It's natural variability that occurs. So you start out perhaps as a giraffe with a slightly longer neck, and that means that you're going to be able to get food that some of the other giraffes can't. You're going to have more food, more resources, more energy, and you're going to have a slightly easier time. Now, you might get struck by lightning, you might get, there might be some accident, you might still get eaten by a lion, whatever. It's not going to assure you that you're going to survive, but having a slightly longer neck makes it slightly more probable that you will survive and you will have children. Those children are fairly likely to inherit the same trait if this is, of course, a genetic trait. And now you're going to have offspring that have slightly longer necks. And within those offspring, there's going to be variability. And the offspring that has the longest neck, again, is going to have a slightly better chance at surviving. So over time, we would expect longer necked individuals to be selected for, and we would expect longer necks to become more common within the population. So again, not use and disuse. We're just talking about the selection of naturally occurring variants. But there's one more aspect to having a long neck if you're a giraffe. The long neck is also selected for sexually. And that's because males will take their heads and they will forcefully swing them like a pendulum and pound into the bodies of rival males. This is a way of fighting in giraffes. If you have a longer neck, you're more likely, if you're a male, to scare away rival males, and you're more likely to get a mate. And if you're more likely to get a mate, you're more likely to leave behind offspring. And if you're more likely to leave behind offspring, then you're more likely to increase the frequency of that trait in the next generation. Not to mention the female giraffes find that trait, a long neck, rather sexy. So there's two things going on here that cause giraffes to get longer necks. Natural selection, because they could reach food they couldn't otherwise, and also sexual selection, because if you have a longer neck, you're more likely to mate and leave behind offspring. Before we go on, I think I would be somewhat remiss if I didn't mention Alfred Wallace. You've probably never heard of this guy. Alfred Wallace was a biologist. He was a European that managed to travel the same way Darwin had. He went to the Amazon, and while he was in the Amazonian jungle, he came to the same conclusions that Darwin had. He came up with the theory of natural selection on his own, independently from Darwin, and he also came up with this idea of sexual selection. Darwin had been working on his theory for a very long time. He was kind of worried about it because, like I mentioned, he was quite religious. He was worried about any conflicts between his religious beliefs and this new theory he had come up with. He was really concerned with how people would perceive this, and he spent decades looking for evidence. People were pushing him to publish, but he kept saying, no, I need more evidence. I need to do a bit more work. Along comes Alfred Wallace, who had been working on this for a much shorter period of time, had written a very short paper and sent it to Darwin. Darwin was a big hero of his, and he sent this letter to Darwin just stating, I've come up with this idea. What do you think? And Darwin, as you might imagine, was immediately rather heartbroken because this was his life's work, and this guy had come to the exact same conclusions, and he was ready to publish. Darwin talked to his good buddy, Charles Lyell. Remember, Charles Lyell was one of the geologists that told us the Earth was very, very old. And Charles Lyell acted kind of as a moderator. He wrote to Alfred Wallace and he said, look, you and Chuck have come up with the exact same idea here. Can you just wait a bit and maybe the two of you can write a paper and publish it together? And that's what they did. So in 1858, they wrote a very short paper together and published that. But again, Wallace has kind of been lost to history. If Wallace had gone ahead and just published his paper without waiting, we'd be talking about, well, Wallacean evolution and not Darwinian evolution. Darwin was really worried about how his ideas would be perceived. He was quite religious. He struggled with what this theory meant in terms of his own religious beliefs. He was worried that he would be an outcast if he published his paper. So he spent decades collecting data, and he put all this data into something he called the abstract. It was a very, very long essay. And by the time Wallace came along, this abstract was over 1,000 pages long. And people like Charles Lyell had been telling him, you got to just wrap this up. You got to publish this. So he took his abstract and he shrunk it down, and he did publish The Origin of Species in 1859. So 1 year after Wallace and him had written a little paper together. This was still a pretty long book. We'll just take a look at the title here, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Just point out one thing there. The term race was used a bit differently back then. What he's talking about are basically different breeds of animals and plants, and the fact that we have these different populations that are specialized in different ways, and some of them win out over others because they're better adapted to their environment. But this was a very significant piece of work, of course, and it really got biologists thinking. And it wasn't that long, only a couple of decades, before almost all biologists were on board with this, and most of them were looking for more evidence to support this model, this theory. I'm going to sum up Darwin's theory by using this rather silly cartoon. This is a cartoon by Gary Larson. He's unfortunately been retired for quite a while, but he is the best biological cartoonist. And in this cartoon, we have a mother praying mantis, and she is giving a rather harsh pep talk to her children. So we've got all of her children lined up, and she's saying, of course, long before you mature, most of you will be eaten. She's telling them the facts of life. For most natural populations, parents overproduce. They produce a lot of extra offspring, far more offspring than can possibly survive. And there is kind of a fight for survival that goes on. They have to compete for resources. They have to avoid predation, etc. But in this little cohort of little baby praying mantises, there's a lot of variability. They're all genetically different. They're all a bit different in terms of their behaviors, in terms of all sorts of traits, in terms of how fast they are, etc., that might make them better able to survive. So praying mantises will make an egg case. There's a few hundred eggs in there. They all hatch out at the same time, and they're picked off by ants and birds and all sorts of other things. This mother would be lucky if 2 or 3 of her children survive to maturity. What's going to help them? Well, there's lots of different things that might help them survive. For instance, maybe this little guy down here is really, really fast. Don't worry, Ma, I can run really, really fast. I was born to run. That one's going to get away from predators, maybe. Slightly more likely to get away from predators. Maybe it's going to get more prey, more to eat. So it's more likely to survive to maturity. Remember that it really all comes down to how many offspring you produce and how many of those offspring survive to the next generation. So even if you are really fast, if you're really good at getting away from predators, you're really strong, you're really good at getting food and feeding yourself, if you don't mate, it doesn't matter, because all those traits that made you successful are not going to be passed on to the next generation, and they're going to disappear. So we have another case here. This little girl in the front here, you know, big deal. Get a load of these gametes. I'm an egg factory, I tell you. So if she survives to maturity, and let's say she can produce 50% more eggs than all of these other girls out there, she's going to leave behind more offspring. So it's not just about surviving. It's about finding a mate, mating, and leaving behind offspring. But it doesn't matter if you can produce a lot of sperm or eggs if you don't find a mate. You have to mate as well. Again, if you don't mate, if you don't leave behind offspring, in terms of Darwinian fitness, you're a dead end. You haven't added anything to the next generation. So we have another little guy over here, and he's saying, sure, but look how cute I am. The girls are going to love me. So maybe he's especially good at attracting mates. Maybe he smells really good. He produces some really nice pheromones, or he is really, really pretty. He has the right dance. If we're talking about birds, he has the right song. He has the right colors, whatever. If he can attract lots of mates, he can leave behind more offspring, and his traits are going to become more common in the next generation. And that's because he's passing down genes that code for those traits. That's passed down to the next generation. Those versions of those genes become more common in the next generation. And that causes the population over time to change and evolve. And we'll get into the specifics of that in a lot more detail later on. To sum up for now, let's just take a look at Darwin's key insights. And I have 5 of them, and this would be a good short answer question, by the way. His first insight is that populations overproduce. We have more offspring being created each generation. I'm talking about natural populations here. I'm not talking about human populations at the moment. We'll come back to that. But in most natural populations, we have more offspring being produced than can be supported by the resources that are available. Populations, despite that, tend to remain stable in size. So we didn't talk about this, but Darwin noticed that if you look at the number of songbirds, let's say, from year to year, it's about the same, even though they lay lots of eggs. They have lots of babies. The population remains the same, which means, of course, that lots of those offspring, lots of those children are dying. They're not making it to maturity. And that is the case for most natural populations. Resources in an environment are limited, like I said. So there's too many offspring being produced. There aren't enough resources. Not all of them survive. Individuals vary within a population. Now, this is the big difference between him and Lamarck. Remember, Lamarck suggested that populations change over time because they sort of want to change. They are stretching their necks. They are growing appendages over their lifespan. Appendages that aren't used are dwindling away, and then that's passed on. Darwin, instead, said that within any, let's say, a litter of animals or a clutch of eggs, there is going to be variation. Not all of those individuals are the same, and some of them will have traits that are really helpful, and some of them might have traits that are really harmful. And the ones that have the good traits are more likely to survive to adulthood. They're more likely to pass those traits on to the next generation. And I did mention he did kind of waffle back and forth on this. In fact, the Origin of Species was rewritten several times, and his later editions he went a bit more Lamarckian, but most biologists like to kind of ignore that. The variation is inherited. That's another big thing. So Darwin suggested in his early books on the origin of species that organisms were born with certain traits, and those traits were hardwired somehow. Darwin didn't know about genes and how they worked. That came a bit later, and we'll talk about that later. But Darwin hypothesized that the variation that we see in the offspring, in the young children, is genetically coded. It's hardwired, and that variation is passed down. And that as you develop over your life and change, again, maybe you go to the gym and get big muscles, that doesn't change that code. It doesn't change what's passed on to the next generation. So to kind of sum that up, Individuals compete for resources and mates. Traits that increase the chances of survival and reproductive success will become more common in the next generation because they're inherited by the next generation. Individuals that have bad traits, they're going to get weeded out. The bad traits are going to get weeded out. The good traits are going to be passed on. They're going to become more common. So that's kind of Darwinian evolution in a nutshell. Now this is, like I said, a really long topic, so I'm going to do one more PowerPoint on this where we talk about some of the misconceptions of evolution. So stay tuned for that.